Good morning. Good morning to all of you. I hope you are all safe and well. My thoughts and prayers are with those of you who are facing certain hardships at this time. Do you know what the most dreaded question of a job interview is? And when it's asked, most of us can hardly push the words out of our mouths. It's when the interviewer looks at you and says, "Tell me, what's your greatest weakness?" How do you answer that question? I don't think any of us like that question. I mean, if I say I don't have any weaknesses, I'll sound arrogant and I'll be lying. But if I'm honest about my weakness, I might not get the job. Career counselors offer different kind of strategies for answering this question. And one way is to disguise your weakness as a strength. For example, you can say, "I'm such a perfectionist. I sometimes expect too much of myself or others." Another strategy is to minimize your weaknesses by explaining how you have already overcome it, by saying something like, "I can be a very task-oriented person, but I've learned that working with people is the most effective way to accomplish a goal." Strategies to disguise weaknesses, strategies to minimize weaknesses. We just don't want to talk about them, do we? Revealing our weaknesses is one of the last things we want to do, whether we're looking for a job, trying to get a relationship going, or just talking with our friends. If you are like me, we don't like to admit our weaknesses to ourselves and especially to others. Why? Because we believe weakness is bad and strength is good. And this is why most of us do everything we can to avoid or overcome or hide our weaknesses, because we don't want to feel vulnerable. We don't want to feel weak. That frightens us. And so we come up with all kinds of strategies to try and protect ourselves from weaknesses. We try to hide by perhaps always making a joke of something, or by being aggressive or sarcastic. We try to control our lives. We hide our true thoughts and feelings because we have a fear of getting hurt, a fear of people finding out something about us that will embarrass us. In our section of scripture today, Paul writes about something that doesn't seem to make sense. "When I am weak, then I am strong." What does that mean? Think of a weakness you have. Is it possible that you can be strong in a weakness? Paul also went on to say, "I delight in weaknesses." He didn't say I hide them, but I delight in them. They make me glad. Another translation says, "I am content with my weaknesses." What is Paul saying? In this section, 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 to 10, Paul says he was given a thorn in his flesh, and he said he pleaded with the Lord to take it away from him. But God said to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." There's been a lot of speculation about what Paul means by a thorn in the flesh. Some say it was an illness, some say it was depression or anxiety, perhaps malaria. But I believe it was certain people, certain false teachers, troublemakers who were so challenging and causing Paul so much pain and distress that he begged God to take them away. If you think about it, most pressures in life are caused by people, annoying people and selfish people and difficult people and jealous people and needy people. Have you ever said, "So-and-so brings out the worst of me. They push my buttons, and then you really see my dark side"? Well, you're really saying they really see my weaknesses. But to get back to Paul's thorn, it doesn't matter what the thorn was. It was something so painful, so irritating, so exhausting that Paul begged God again and again to take it away. But that's what thorns do, don't they? They hurt, they cut, they distract you, they stop you from doing what you should be doing. In Paul's situation, his thorn was bringing to the surface a weakness that Paul had. Maybe at that time, his weakness was a lack of patience with people. Maybe he had a bad temper. Maybe he struggled with resentment or bitterness or unforgiveness. Whatever his weakness was, it was driving him crazy. But we all have our weaknesses. I've got lots of them. What is your weakness? What personal weakness or vulnerability causes you pain and handicaps your ability to connect with people, to serve Christ with, freely and effectively, and to be who you really are in Jesus? Maybe it's something obvious. Maybe it's something no one would ever guess. It could be an illness, or it could be a fear of people. It could be a lack of courage. It could be a lack of determination when going through difficult times. I was reading about Charles Spurgeon. He was one of the giants of the modern church era, and he was a powerful preacher in London, and he was author of about 200 books, and he was a man greatly loved and admired and respected, but he often suffered from serious depression. He often had to spend weeks in bed because of different illnesses, and he frequently worried about his money, his finances. He was open about the fact that during a very serious illness, he wrote these words. He said, an unaccountable fit of anxiety about money matters that I have. See, he was just like us. He had many weaknesses. He had his doubts, his anxieties, his struggles with emotion. And God doesn't always take away the thorns in our flesh and our weaknesses, but you know what? God is always with us despite our flaws. And that's the theme for this week. God is with us despite our flaws, despite our weaknesses. And he can use our weaknesses, he can transform our weaknesses into strengths. And how does God do that? Well, let's learn from Paul today. Paul pleaded with the Lord about his thorn in the flesh, but God told Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. In other words, my grace is always more than enough for you. So Paul doesn't tell us what the thorn was, but the Lord does tell us about the wonder of his grace. He says it is sufficient. But what's that about? The Lord didn't remove the thorn, but what did God do? When you look at what Paul was going through, you see a before and an after. We find Paul's before in these words in verse 8. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. In other words, he begged, he pleaded with God to remove whatever was causing this pain in his life. But the Lord said, no, Paul, I'm not going to take away the people or the thing that's causing the pressure, the pain, the annoyance, the weakness in your life. But Paul, I'm going to show you something far greater than you are asking for. Because you see, I'm going to show you something that, it's far more than you've ever dreamed of. You see, my grace is more than enough for you. So now we come to the after. What was Paul's response to the words of the Lord? I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Verse 10, for the sake of Christ, then I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. Because when I'm weak, then I am strong. Now, this is a very different Paul. He's now saying he will boast about his weaknesses. He will admit to his flaws. He will be very open about his faults, his failures. He won't try to hide them, because they are areas where others see how he fails, even while he says that God is working through him. What has happened here? Paul was transformed. There was a change in his thinking. He had a life-changing revelation. He saw things as God saw them. It was as if God was saying to Paul, You are not seeing this as I am seeing it, Paul. You are seeing this as if I'm not around, as if I'm not with you and in you. Get your eyes off the thorn. Stop focusing on your weaknesses. Focus on me. I know how painful it is, but start delighting in my grace. Now, we're not talking about denial now. You see, now Paul was looking at his thorn, his pain, his weaknesses in a totally different way. That's why he can say, but now I boast. I'm delighted by my weakness. How could he say that? It sounds crazy. Well, he saw that God was still with him and God was still working through him. He could still participate with Jesus in what he was doing in preaching the gospel. God just didn't leave him and say, well, you've got these weaknesses. I'm going to work through someone else. No, he discovered that when he is weak, he is strong. So what is really happening here? Wouldn't you like to say the same thing as Paul said? I would. But how? Let's take a closer look at Paul's words in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 to 10, and discover 5 truths about this section that enable us to be strong when we are weak. And they have a lot to do with grace. The first one is grace is more than we realize. Grace is much more than we realize. What is grace? If I had to stop now and throw out this question, what is grace? What would your answer be? Would you say grace is unmerited or undeserved favor, undeserved pardon? What about the old favorite, God's riches at Christ's expense? You know, these definitions are fine, but in reality, they are just okay. And I say just okay because there's so much more to grace. The more you understand about grace, the more you realize there's more and more and more. Actually, grace reminds me of the Russian dolls. Have you seen them? It's a set of wooden dolls of decreasing size. You get the big doll, then you get a smaller one, and then another smaller one, and so on. And they fit into one another. So you open one, and there's another one, and then another one, and then another one. The grace of God is like that. You understand God's grace at one level, but then you discover another deeper level, and on and on. In the grace of God, you have this continual unwrapping and the discovering of something new about grace. Every time you think you understand it, then it opens up more and more and more, and you see it like you've never seen it before. It's so easy to read right over the word grace in the Bible and think, yes, I know what that word means. It's God's favor, but it's a religious word. It's a nice word in the Bible. No, the grace of God is not a nice, sentimental word that is abstract and an old-fashioned word. No, grace is the most important, most life-changing, power-packed word in the New Testament. It's the foundation of the gospel, and it's a gift from God to you. But there's more. Grace has to do with power. Verse 9, my grace, Paul talking, my grace, no, Jesus talking, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Now Paul says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses. Why? So that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Do you see that? Grace and power, they go together. Grace is the imparted power, the imparted energy of God. You know, the Wist translation is a literal Bible translation that apparently follows the word order in the Greek quite strictly. Look at this. My grace is enough for you, for power is moment by moment coming to its full energy and complete operation in the sphere of weakness. But God says, my power. Grace is the personal power the personal energy of God entering our lives and transforming us. And so Paul was transformed. His mind was renewed. And he looked at his thorn, his pressure, his weaknesses differently now. I can just hear him saying, at first I begged God to take the thorn away. Now I boast. Now I'm content. You see, grace has in its meaning empowerment. Grace is divine empowerment. It's divine enablement, divine energy to live in this present moment. Grace is the love of God in action. Grace is the kindness of God at every moment towards us. It's his gentleness, it's his wisdom, it's his kindness, his joy. His grace is the personal empowering of the Father through Jesus by the Holy Spirit. So grace empowers us. Grace contains within itself the power to do what it is giving. Within grace is the power to do it. And grace empowers us to become all we are meant to be. The grace of God is intensely personal. It's not some outside vague force. It teaches us, it instructs us how to live the Christian life. You can read that in Titus chapter 2. Grace has a million faces, but when you go back to its heart, grace is the person of Jesus Christ coming to live in you, and you live in him. He is the gift. He has gifted us with himself and comes to live in us. Do you see that? Grace is the love of God coming to us now. So first point, first observation, first truth, grace is much more than we may realize, which actually overlaps into observation or truth number 2, which is there is a connection between God's grace, God's power, and our weaknesses. Do you remember these words? My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses. Why? So that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And does Paul say, when I'm weak, God takes away the trouble? Now, he does sometimes, but not every time, as in Paul's situation. Does Paul say, when I'm weak, God takes away my weakness? No, he says, but he says, when I am weak, then I am strong. The word weakness also means helplessness. He says, when I'm weak, when I'm helpless, then God's grace, his power is released. Another way of saying this is God is speaking to Paul, and God says to Paul, your weakness is the arena in which my grace is brought to its fulfillment. My grace, my strength, my power, my divine enablement shows up the best in your weakness. So number 2 is there's a connection between God's grace, God's power, and our weakness. Number 3, learn to be totally dependent on God. Paul is very open in this section. Paul doesn't hide his weaknesses. He says, I will boast gladly about my weakness. We like to be independent. I can do it. I can achieve it all by myself. You could put it this way. Helplessness, weaknesses are a prerequisite, a requirement, a condition for the display of Christ's strength. So Paul says, when I am weak and the grace of God comes, then I am strong in his strength. So take a lesson from Paul. Don't be ashamed to admit that you are weak. Have you heard of kintsugi? It's a Japanese art form that repairs broken pottery by mixing gold dust with a kind of varnish. So instead of hiding the cracks, this art form highlights them. By the 17th century, kintsugi was not only used for repair, but also to decorate and make pots used for tea more beautiful. But kintsugi is more than just artwork. It also is linked to Japanese philosophical ideas. And one idea is that imperfection is accepted as part of life and teaches this philosophical, this idea teaches that we should see beauty in the imperfect. It's about seeing beauty in the imperfect. When we think about our personal imperfections, we don't want to highlight them with gold dust, do we? We would prefer to keep them in the dark. But Paul discovered just the opposite. And Paul is saying here, I've come to see, and I admit, and I embrace my weakness. And in so doing, I discover this power that is the very life of Jesus available now for me, through me, by me, to me, in me, as me. So God is saying, my grace is more than enough for you. If you will receive it, you'll find that it will equip you, it'll supply you with more than you need to deal with in any situation. My love power, when you think of power, think of God's love power, is always on hand, available to help you in moments when you are weak and needy. Then you are strong. So, number 3, learn to be totally dependent on God. Number 4, a tent is waiting for someone helpless enough to receive it. What is that all about? That sounds so weird. In verse 9, Paul writes about the power of Christ resting upon him. And it's fascinating. The words rest upon me literally mean, so the power of Jesus may rest on me like a tent. I know that sounds strange, but the idea is of his power coming upon us like a tent. In other words, Paul is saying, when I feel my weakness, my helplessness, then a tenting of God's grace comes upon me. Once again, let's look at the Worcester translation. Therefore, most gladly will I the rather boast in my weaknesses, in order that the power of the Christ, like the Shekinah glory in the Holy of Holies of the tent of meeting, may take up its residence in me, working within me and giving me help. So Paul's weaknesses put Paul in the position of helplessness to receive God's grace. It's like saying that the tent was there, just waiting for him to feel helpless enough to receive it. That actually, the word rest here could also be a picture of the presence of God resting in the Holy of Holies in the temple. Paul is saying that in a similar way, Jesus, the power of Jesus, power of his grace was enveloping him. So do you see what this is all about? God's power was perfected in Paul's weakness. God's power was able to be used because of Paul's weaknesses. This actually reminds me of the lyrics from Leonard Cohen's song, Anthem. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Amazing words if you deeply think about them. And perhaps our cracks or weaknesses work both ways. They allow God to enter and work in us, and they are the way that his work is extended out of us. As Christians, we are witnesses to the world that God works in us despite our weaknesses. Actually, that last line of that song, that's how the light gets in, reminds us, it should remind us that Jesus meets us exactly in our darkest, most vulnerable, most weakest, most sinful places. And there he shines his love and forgiveness and grace into us. Beautiful picture. So, number 4, a tent is waiting for someone helpless enough to receive it. Number 5, learn contentment. Verse 10, for the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses. And he goes on. Now, you might be thinking, I wish I had the gift of contentment. But wait, Paul said in Philippians chapter 4, I have learned how to be content with whatever I have. I can do everything through Christ who strengthens me, who gives me strength. I love the way the Passion Translation has it. I'm trained in the secret of overcoming all things. And I find that the strength of Christ's explosive power infuses me to conquer every difficulty. But he says, I've learned to be content. And how did he learn to be content? Well, I believe that he learned that from what we've learned in this chapter, in this section. Today, when he was weak, he learned he was strong. Contentment is something we learn. And this is a lesson Paul learned. Paul was convinced that Jesus was in the middle, in the midst of his life, every day, pouring his power, pouring his strength into him. And Paul says that he's content with being vulnerable and not hiding his weaknesses and flaws, helped him preach the gospel more effectively, he's saying. He is a more effective Christian leader because he doesn't have to hide his weaknesses. He doesn't have to keep them as secrets. There's no secrets in his life. And others look at him, and they say, wow, this man, he's just like me. I can relate to him. Your weaknesses can be used by God to draw people to you. I mean, have you noticed that you feel more comfortable around someone who is not perfect as compared to someone who seems to have it all together? I remember once speaking to someone who was my senior, and he was in charge of me, or he was over me. And because of that, there was a bit of a wall between us. But, one day, over a cup of coffee, just briefly, he spoke to me about some of his fears. And that wall was broken. I realized he's just like me. I had similar fears. And we actually developed a special friendship. Vulnerability can make us more effective as Christians, as leaders, whether we are parents and managers at work or church leaders. Being vulnerable helps our relationships. How could Paul be content with unpleasant things like weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecutions and troubles? Well, when I'm weak, then I'm strong. That is the key to the section that we're reading today. And it's the key to our life. One of the keys to our lives, the key to handling pressure, to handling our weaknesses. Paul is content because he's saying, I love it when Jesus shows up in my weakness as my strength. Then God's grace, his power is released. So 5, learn contentment. So what are your weaknesses? What's a weakness of yours? For example, do you find yourself often playing the victim? Woe is me, poor me, it's everybody else's fault, blaming everybody else. Or do you see your situations as opportunities, as possibilities of something amazing? I could go around saying, I'm always so lonely. I'm always so lonely. Or I could ask if this is the potential to receive the comfort of Jesus. I could say something like, that person, she really gets on my nerves. Or what about, wow, but what an opportunity to manifest the love and the kindness and the gentleness of Jesus and the grace of Jesus into this person's life. Or it may be a time, an opportunity to confront that person in the love of God. So we have our weaknesses. And often these weaknesses manifest their ugly heads when we are feeling pressure, when we are worrying, when we perhaps are envious, and we feel so disappointed with ourselves. And we feel, we failed God. And we go to God and we say, God, I'm sorry. I just don't have my flaws, my weaknesses under control. And, when we do that, we think that God is saying, yeah, oh no, it's you again. You did it again. When are you going to learn? But God never says that. Never. You have a Father who loves you more than you love your own children or your parents. What can you do? Oh, here's something you can do. Learn to be still. Learn to stop in your daily life. Stop what you're doing and just think and realize that grace is, or put it this way, realize what grace is after what we've learned today. Realize what grace is and realize the presence of Jesus is all around you. If you can, go somewhere quiet for even just maybe even 5 minutes. Believe God is in you and you are in him in this very moment, and believe who you truly are. You are a grace-filled person with weaknesses, but give thanks to God because the strength of God is in your weakness today. Amen.